be thirsty. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Thank you. You may be seated. Some of you who are in here this morning may be familiar with the best-selling book series, Eat This, Not That. It got its start back in 2007 from a column in the Men's Health magazine written by David Zinczenko and Matt Goulding. However, since that time, it has just exploded into a whole series of books and magazines, including things like the Supermarket Survival Guide, a list of the best and worst foods in America, a nutrition guide for kids, and a whole series of magazines. The franchise brands itself as the no-diet weight loss solution. And it focuses more on the swapping of foods, choosing good food choices versus choices that are not so good for us, and developing health-conscious recipes. Well, I couldn't help but think about all of this as I reflected on our gospel lesson for this morning. You may recall that our gospel lesson takes place the day after Jesus fed the 5,000, the day before the crowds had come to Jesus. But when they got to him, they were tired and they were hungry, and so Jesus began to look around for a way to meet their needs. About that time, a young boy stepped forward. He had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he offered what he had to give, and in the hands of Jesus, it was all it took. Jesus blessed it, distributed it, and by the time everything was said and done, the disciples had gathered up 12 baskets of leftovers. Well, that night, the disciples and later Jesus crossed over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the next morning, when the crowds woke up, Jesus was gone. And so they began to look for him, and they found him in Capernaum. However, when Jesus saw them coming toward him, he sensed that the only reason that they were following him was because he had met their physical necessities. And Jesus, of course, wanted to push them further than that. He wanted them to see that he could do so much more for them than simply meet their physical needs. And so when he got their attention, he said to them, "Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life." And then a moment later, he said, "I am the bread of life. And whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Now, I don't know if you'll hear it the same way that I did, but as I was reflecting on that, I heard Jesus saying, listen, eat this, not just that. Now, Jesus knew as well as anybody about the importance and the necessity of food. That's why he fed the people the fish and the loaves before he started talking to them about the bread of life. Jesus didn't know anything about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but he was keenly aware that one of the most basic needs that any of us have is the need for food. And Jesus knew that before you try to talk to people about their spiritual lives, you better make sure that you have dealt with their physical hunger, which parenthetically is one of the reasons why this church is involved in things like Food Stock and Mission Mondays and other ministries to help feed the hungry. Food matters. Of course, here in our society, we've kind of taken this to a whole new level, haven't we? We've, in many respects, become a food-crazed culture. Go into any fast food restaurant and you're likely to find food to the max. Now, some of you who are in here are old enough to remember, as I am, fast food restaurants when they first came on the scene. When they first came on the scene, they offered a simple thing. They offered a little hamburger. And then as things developed, they offered a bigger hamburger. And then they offered a double bigger hamburger. And then they offered a triple bigger hamburger. And the other day, when Carol and I were traveling, we stopped in a fast food restaurant just to get something to drink. And there it was, the Monster Burger. Now, I didn't actually have it, but I just decided to do a little bit of checking on its nutritional value. And here's what I learned. It has 2/3 pound of beef, 4 slices of bacon, and 3 slices of cheese. It comes with all of the toppings, and it is covered in mayonnaise. It has 1,330 calories, 95 grams of fat, 2,820 milligrams of sodium, and 215 milligrams of cholesterol. And if you order the combo, it comes with a large fry, a large drink, and your own large cemetery headstone with it. Andy Rooney once said that the 2 best-selling books in America are cookbooks and diet books. The cookbooks tell you how to fix delicious foods, and the diet books tell you that you can't eat them. Orson Welles once said, my doctor advised me that I had to give up those intimate little dinners for 4, unless, of course, there were 3 other people there to eat them with me. And one of my favorites has to do with Weight Watchers. At one of their weekly meetings right near Easter, a lady stood up and she proudly announced, she said, "This is the first Easter that my children learned that chocolate Easter bunnies come with ears." Now that's going to take a minute for some of you. Listen, I'm saying this not pointing a finger at anybody else, because you have only to look at me to realize that I'm the chief of sinners. Jesus knew the importance of food. He was not where our society is with it, but he understood that food matters. I can't imagine, can you? Jesus bumping into somebody who was physically hungry or starving and not being moved to the absolute core of his being, which is why he often referenced food and then said things like, "Inasmuch as you've done it to one of the least of these, you have done it to me." Food matters. But Jesus also understood and wanted us to understand that there is a hunger that goes way beyond physical hunger, a hunger that stands back behind that hunger. It's a spiritual hunger. It's a hunger for a meaning and a purpose in life. It's a hunger to know and be in relationship with God. And because of that, Jesus knew it is entirely possible for a person to be physically nourished and yet spiritually starved. Listen, it's a terrible thing to see someone who is physically malnourished. I've seen it, and it is a terrible thing. And we should always do everything we can to try and alleviate that hunger. But it is equally tragic to see someone who is physically nourished and yet spiritually starved. And part of what makes spiritual starvation such a dangerous condition is that often people don't know they have it until the moment of a crisis arises. For a time they go through life, they have all that they need, and they seem to be happy, and they seem to be going along through life fairly smoothly, and then a crisis comes along, and that's the moment when they realize that they haven't given attention to their souls the way they need to, and suddenly they don't have the strength, the inner strength to meet the challenge or the demand that the crisis puts before them. As the bread of life, Jesus not only can meet our spiritual hunger, but He can nourish us with that strength that enables us to meet whatever demand, whatever challenge, whatever difficulty comes our way. In regard to this, I'm reminded of a scene from a movie that was released years ago, but I was reminded of it just a couple of weeks ago. I was flipping channels on the television, and I landed on one of those channels that shows old movies, and the movie that was on was a movie entitled Places in the Heart, starring Sally Field. And if any of you have seen that movie, you know that it's really sort of a sad movie filled with heartache and hardship. It takes place, it's set in the Depression days, and the movie opens with Sally Field's husband, who happens to be the sheriff of the little town, being shot and killed by a drunk. And suddenly she and the two children are left alone with little money and no prospects for the future. And as they try to make their way through life, they run into one brick wall after another. There's a man in town who tries to take advantage of her financially. She's forced to take in a boarder that she doesn't really want to take in order to meet her financial challenges. The bank refuses to work with her on any of her financial difficulties. And then a tornado rips through the town. And near the end of the movie, the one man in town that has helped her and cared for her and loved her was an African-American man, and he's beaten and forced to leave town by the Ku Klux Klan. And it's just this sad movie filled with heartache and hardship. But right at the end of the movie, it all comes together. The final scene takes place in the town church. It is Communion Sunday. And the pastor stands and he reads some verses from 1 Corinthians 13 that talk about love. And then the bread and the cup begin to be passed in the pews. They're not a Methodist church. Passed in the pews. And as you watch, you notice that all of the people who have touched her life in one way or another are gathered there in that sanctuary. There's the man who has taken advantage of her, and he's eating the communion. There's the boarder and the banker and the African-American man who was forced to leave town. There's her husband and the man who shot her husband. And they're all taking this communion. And as you're watching this, you're wondering, what's going on here? And then you remember the title, Places in the Heart. And it begins to make sense. That Christ, as the bread of life, has been with her through every one of these experiences, strengthening her, nourishing her, enabling her to meet the demands and challenges of them. In fact, he's not only done that, he's helped her to redeem them. Redeem them. Listen, there are some of you in here this morning who you are physically nourished, but inside of you there is a deep hunger that hasn't yet been filled. As the bread of life, Christ can fill that hunger. And there may be some of you in here this morning who are facing challenges and you're wondering, how am I going to get through this? And as the bread of life, Christ can nourish you and strengthen you so that you can meet and face those challenges. So, dear friends, on this and every day, be sure that as you're eating all of these other foods, you make sure that you eat the bread of life as well. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning.